Look at a corn cob. Hundreds of kernels packed tightly together. Now look at a modern tomato. Large, juicy, colorful, and filled with seeds. Both seem like completely ordinary foods. But here's the strange part. Neither of them originally looked anything like this. Thousands of years ago, the ancestors of these plants were wild. Corn was not a giant cob. Its ancient relative was a wild grass called teosinte, with much smaller seed-bearing structures and hard seeds. And the ancestors of modern tomatoes produced tiny fruits that looked nothing like the large tomatoes sitting in supermarkets today. So who transformed them? There were no genetic laboratories, no microscopes, no scientists studying DNA, no machines creating new plants. Instead, there were ancient people walking through forests and grasslands, collecting wild plants simply because they needed something to eat. And without realizing it, those people began one of the greatest experiments in human history. They started choosing which plants would reproduce. And after hundreds, then thousands of generations, wild plants began turning into crops. But how did they even know which plants to choose? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Our story begins in ancient Mesoamerica, particularly in areas of what is now Mexico. Long before modern agriculture, people depended heavily on wild plants. One of the most important plants connected to the origin of corn was teosinte. Teosinte is a wild grass, and if you saw it growing today, you might not immediately recognize it as the ancestor of corn. Its seed-bearing structures are relatively small. Its kernels are enclosed in hard coverings. And compared with modern maize, there is surprisingly little edible material. So why would ancient humans collect it? Because survival changes the way you look at nature. A small amount of food can still matter when you're feeding a family. People who repeatedly gathered plants would have learned which species were edible, when they produced seeds, where they grew, and which plants were worth returning to. And they would also notice something incredibly important. Wild plants are not identical. One plant might produce slightly larger seeds. Another might have more seeds. Another might grow in a better location. Another might be easier to harvest. Those tiny differences would eventually become the raw material for domestication. At first, humans didn't necessarily need to control plants. They could simply gather what nature provided. But eventually, something changed. Instead of traveling to find every useful plant, people began growing plants closer to where they lived. This was one of the biggest changes in human history. Imagine an ancient community collecting seeds from wild plants. Some seeds are eaten immediately, but others fall onto the ground. Later, new plants grow. People begin to notice the connection. If a useful plant grows here, perhaps we can deliberately plant its seeds here next season. This doesn't happen overnight. Agriculture developed gradually in different parts of the world, and different crops were domesticated at different times. But once humans began deliberately growing plants, they could influence which plants survived and reproduced. And that created a completely new relationship between humans and nature. Humans were no longer simply gathering plants. They were beginning to manage their reproduction. Here is the fascinating part. Ancient farmers didn't need to understand genetics. They only needed to make choices. Imagine a field containing dozens of plants. Some are tall, some are short, some produce more seeds, some produce fewer, some have larger edible parts, some are easier to harvest. If a farmer repeatedly saves seeds from the most useful plants, those plants become the parents of the next generation. Then the same process happens again and again. This is known as artificial selection. It is similar to what humans later used to create, different breeds of domesticated animals. But with plants, the process could be extremely slow and gradual. One generation might produce only a tiny difference. The next generation produces another. After hundreds of generations, those tiny differences can accumulate. And after thousands of years, the result can look completely different from the original wild plant. This is exactly the kind of process that helped transform wild grasses into crops such as maize. Now imagine the transformation happening generation by generation. Ancient people prefer plants that provide more useful seeds. So they save seeds from those plants. Those seeds are planted. Among the next generation, some plants have characteristics that people prefer even more. Again, those seeds are saved. Over time, humans favor plants with traits that make them more useful. The edible structures become more valuable. The number of kernels increases. The plant becomes easier to harvest. And the relationship between humans and maize becomes stronger. Modern maize is extremely dependent on humans. A mature corn cob holds many kernels tightly together. Those kernels are protected by the husk. And humans deliberately plant the seeds from the plants they want. Wild teosinte, by comparison, naturally disperses its seeds in a very different way. That difference is one reason domestication was so important. Humans weren't simply finding a better plant. They were gradually changing the plant's entire reproductive relationship with nature. And eventually, teosinte had become maize. Once maize became a reliable crop, its importance went far beyond simply having something to eat. It could be cultivated in large quantities. It could be used in different ways. And it became an important food source for many societies across the Americas. Maize eventually became deeply connected to the cultures of Mesoamerica and later civilizations. But there was another advantage. A crop that can be grown near a settlement gives people a more predictable source of food. That changes human life. Instead of depending entirely on whatever wild plants happen to be available, communities could invest more effort into farming. Agriculture could support larger populations. People could stay in one place for longer periods. Villages could grow. Trade could expand. And societies could become increasingly complex. Of course, corn was not solely responsible for civilization. Human societies developed through many interacting factors. But domesticated crops like maize provided an important foundation for many communities. And then, another plant was undergoing its own transformation, the tomato. The tomato has a very different story. Its wild relatives are associated with western South America, particularly regions around the Andes. The earliest tomatoes were not the large fruits we know today. Wild relatives can produce very small fruits. Some are only a fraction of the size of modern cultivated tomatoes. And there was another important difference. Modern tomatoes come in many colors, shapes, and sizes. Red, yellow, orange, large, small, round, elongated. But these varieties are the result of long histories of selection and breeding. Ancient people living among wild plants would have encountered naturally occurring differences. Some fruits might be larger. Some might taste better. Some plants might produce more fruit. Some might survive better in local conditions. And once humans began cultivating plants, those differences became extremely valuable. Think about eating a wild fruit. You find two plants. One produces tiny, unpleasant fruit. The other produces slightly larger fruit that tastes better. Which one would you remember? Which one would you return to? And if you were growing plants near your settlement, which one's seeds would you be more likely to keep? Probably the better one. This simple behavior can have enormous consequences over time. A farmer doesn't need to say, "I'm selecting for increased fruit size." They simply think, "This fruit is better. I'll plant this one again." That decision affects which plants produce the next generation. If the preferred traits are inherited, those traits become more common over time. Then the process repeats. The fruit gets better suited to human preferences. The plant becomes more useful, and humans become more interested in cultivating it. This is domestication. Not one dramatic event, but thousands of small decisions. As tomato cultivation and selection continued, humans could influence many characteristics. Fruit size, shape, color, texture, taste, yield, and how the plant grows. Different communities could favor different characteristics. That is one reason domesticated crops can eventually develop enormous diversity. Modern tomatoes are a perfect example. A tiny cherry tomato and a giant beefsteak tomato may look like completely different fruits, but they belong to the same species and share a common domestication history. The important lesson is that domestication doesn't necessarily create one perfect plant. Instead, it creates a population of plants, shaped by different environments and human preferences. Over generations, farmers become part of the evolutionary story. Nature provides variation. Humans choose, and reproduction carries some of those choices forward. There is something almost unbelievable about all of this. The ancient farmers responsible for these transformations didn't know what DNA was. They didn't know that traits were influenced by genes. They couldn't see mutations happening inside plant cells. They didn't understand chromosomes, but they could observe results. They could see that certain plants were better than others, and they could control which seeds were planted. In other words, they didn't understand the mechanism, but they understood the outcome. This is why domestication is such a powerful example of human influence on evolution. Humans didn't create corn or tomatoes from nothing. The genetic variation already existed in wild plant populations. Humans repeatedly selected particular variations. Over enormous periods of time, those choices changed the characteristics of the crops. So when you look at modern corn, you're looking at the result of countless generations of selection. And when you look at a tomato, you're seeing another long experiment written into a plant. For thousands of years, maize and tomatoes were connected primarily to the Americas. Then the world changed dramatically after Europeans arrived in the Americas. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, plants from the Americas began moving to other parts of the world. Maize spread widely across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Tomatoes also eventually became established in many regions, although their acceptance was not immediate everywhere. Today, it is difficult to imagine Italian cuisine without tomatoes, or Mexican cuisine without maize, or countless African and Asian food systems without corn. But these foods were not originally global. They began as plants connected to specific ecosystems and human communities in the Americas. Their journey from local crops to worldwide foods is one of the biggest agricultural transformations in human history. So, how did ancient humans discover corn and tomatoes? The answer is more fascinating than a simple discovery story. They didn't find a perfect corn cob growing in the wilderness. They didn't discover a giant supermarket tomato hiding in an ancient forest. They found wild plants. They observed differences. They experimented. They cultivated. They saved seeds. They selected the plants they preferred, and they repeated that process for generations. The most incredible part? They didn't know they were changing evolution. They were simply trying to make food more reliable. A slightly bigger seed. A slightly better fruit. A plant that produced more food. One small decision at a time. Then another generation repeated it. Then another. And another. Thousands of years later, those tiny decisions had transformed the plants completely. So the next time you see a golden corn cob, or cut into a bright red tomato, remember what you're actually looking at. Not just food, not just plants, but the living result of thousands of years of human choices. Ancient humans didn't simply discover corn and tomatoes. They helped create the versions of them that we know today.